Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here. And thank you for the great English weather greeting. I was hoping for something a bit sunnier. Today, I'm going to take you through an extraordinary story, a tale of exploration and discovery. In one of the fields of sciences, this is probably one of the most difficult sciences in the world. This field of science, paleoanthropology, the search for human origins, when I first entered it in 1989, you had less than a 1% chance of actually discovering a single remain of an ancient human during your entire career. Can you imagine the type of people who go into a science with that kind of odds against them in discovery? Another statistic at that time was that there were actually more scientists studying these remains than there were actual fossil remains of ancient human relatives. That made it a rather competitive sport. And so when I started into this field in the late 80s, I wanted to go to East Africa because all the discoveries were coming from East Africa. That was the place, it was even the East Side story of human origins. I quickly found out, though, at the advice of Richard Leakey and Don Johansen, that there was going to be very little room for a young paleoanthropologist who wanted to discover fossils in East Africa. And so I decided to journey to South Africa. In fact, South Africa had been the birthplace of the search for human origins on the continent of Africa way back in 1924 when Raymond Dart had discovered the Tong child. But since 1948, the field had stagnated. There had been no new sites discovered. The only fossils that were being discovered were from traditional known sites. But I threw myself into looking for new fossil sites. And within just a few months of arriving in South Africa, I won the paleoanthropological lottery. At a site called Gladysville, just outside of Johannesburg, I found 2 hominid teeth. Now, I know that doesn't sound a lot to all of you, but to give you an idea of the scarcity of ancient human relative fossils, those 2 hominid teeth made National Geographic magazine, the first new hominid site in subequatorial Africa in 48 years. I threw myself into that site, knowing that the next rock I turned over, the next brushstroke was going to reveal that half of a mandible or jawbone that was going to make my career, and I could dine out at cocktail parties, at conferences for the rest of my life. It didn't happen. 17 years would go by without a major discovery. Oh, I was having a fine career. I was advancing through the normal ranks of paleoanthropology. But by the late 90s, I began to hear at conferences, wow, I've never seen someone go so far on 2 teeth. That was not a compliment. In 2007, I found myself in an unusual position. The world had changed around me. Paleoanthropology had convinced itself that there were no new great fossils to discover. Scientists even published that there were going to be no major alterations in the way we view human evolution, that all the major fossil fields had already been discovered. And the only way forward was to invest in technology into the fossils that we'd already discovered. And so I found myself, who had built an exploration sort of unit at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, in the invidious position of actually serving on a committee to replace myself. To replace myself with a new director who would take us in the direction of technology, using the new computers that were appearing, that could process big data sets, that could actually examine these fossils that already existed, things like geometric morphometrics, and handle large CT data. That was what was getting on the cover of journals like Nature and Science. And so I found myself in December of 2007, sitting at home, pondering where life was going to take me. What was I going to do for the next stage of my career? And like most people who are soul searching, I was surfing the internet for that answer. And it was at that moment that I became the last human being on Earth to discover Google Earth. There it was, free satellite data. And I stared at this going, my gosh, that's amazing, because back in the late 90s, I had won a grant from National Geographic to do something extraordinary and difficult, to combine technology, then available NASA satellite data, with that amazing brand new technology, handheld GPS. And I knew there was a way of bringing those 2 things together. I was certain of it. to find sites that might have great fossils in them. And I'd spent 3 years of my life collecting data. And here was a free way to test that data. And I found that little white box up in the corner. I typed in those coordinates. The first ones I typed in were Gladysville, because I knew that site better than anyone on Earth. And up it went into space, and down it came on absolutely nothing. The next one I put in, same thing. Didn't mark a site at all. Third, fourth one. It didn't take me long to Google to find out why, of course. The US government had owned those satellites in the late 90s. And they had actually put deliberate error into them so they couldn't be used for acts of terrorism and other things. And that deliberate error, combined with the primitive nature of the then handheld GPSs, it created a sort of a compounding error. I'd wasted 3 years of my life. I was sad. But as I stared at that screen, I began to see that I could see the sites that I'd intended to map. And so instead of making a sort of pathetic phone call to National Geographic, I began moving the dots from the wrong place to the right place. And in the process of that, I began to learn what a cave site and what a fossil site looked like from outer space. It was teaching me this error that had occurred. And it also began to make me think, wow, it looks like there might be others out there. But I knew that was impossible. This region just outside of Johannesburg is perhaps the most explored area on planet Earth for sites like this, for these fossils. It's been explored continuously by every major scientist in the field since the mid-1930s. But it was convincing enough that by March of 2008, I'd created a sort of map of where I thought there might be some more fossils. And I, of course, went, because it's human nature, as far away from Gladysville as I could possibly get. I went about 25 kilometers away to the edge of those Dolomites, because this was an unexplored area. That's where new discoveries were going to be made. And on the very first day out, with my dog towel and a laptop and a 3G card, I found 21 new localities. Now, to put that in perspective, in the previous sort of 70, 80, 90 years, there'd only been about 130 total cave sites found and 18 fossil-bearing sites in that region. And on day one, I found 21 new ones. I was addicted. I started throwing myself into this journey of searching for new sites. I became a professor in absentia at Wits because it was addictive, because every time I went out, I'd find more. I'd spend the night making targets, go into the field the next day, and I would find more. It was extraordinary. So extraordinary that by July, I'd found over 750 new localities and almost 70 new fossil sites that no one had ever seen before. By that time, I'd kind of finished the area, and I'd moved back into the area around Gladysville. I'm doing that last because I knew there was nothing there to find. I'd spent 17 years digging at that site. I knew that area better than any human being on Earth. And on that day, on August 1st, 2008, I went to an area that had some trees and targets that looked promising, 1 kilometer away from Gladysville. And there I saw this hole in the ground, a tiny little hole. It didn't look anything like the kind of sites that we actually found fossils in that area typically. The big sites that produce hominids were gigantic sites, full of thousands of fossils, because your odds are so low. But the very first rock I turned over at this site had a fossil in it, a fossil antelope. That didn't excite me very much, because let me give you a little statistic. By that time, I'd done some calculations to tell us that for every one fragment of an ancient human relative that we discover, we would find about 250,000 antelope fossils. And I just found another one. This had been the story of my life at Gladysville for 17 years. But I was on a mapping mission that day, so I just took notes, took a photograph, and then walked up the hill and found 47 previously unidentified sites, 1 kilometer from where I'd spent a big chunk of my life looking. That bothered me a little bit. I went back to the lab, and I didn't tell you this, but we'd had a terrible tragedy. The young person that we had selected to replace me and to build this new technological era, this new technological department at Wits University, was actually killed in a motorcycle accident here in London. And so we'd already built these labs, we'd brought in postdocs. These people are rare and precious, these experts in these fields. And so a young postdoc who is now without a mentor came into my office, Job Kibbe, a Kenyan. And he said, "Would you be my postdoctoral supervisor?" And I said to him, "No." I wasn't being cruel. But I said, "Job, you're a lab guy. I'm a field guy, but I've just found this site. And if you're interested in maybe learning how to be a field guy, it intrigues me. Let's go out and look at it." And so on August the 15th, 2008, Job and I and my then 9-year-old son Matthew, my dog Tao, went out to the site and started walking up to it. I told them the story of discovery. And there we were standing right about where this picture was taken. I said, "Okay, guys, go find fossils." They were all around us in the rocks. And with that, Matthew and Tao take off. This is in a gigantic game reserve. There are antelopes, leopards, zebra. I thought they're off chasing those. I'll see them at lunchtime. And I turned to Job and I said, "I wonder why this had been left by miners." Because miners had worked this area for lime, and they clearly found this place. There were a couple of blast holes. That was the rock I'd found was a loose one from blasting. But they left it alone very quickly. And as I finished saying that, Matthew said, "Dad, I found a fossil." There I could see him, 15 meters off the site. There shouldn't be any fossils there. But, because like all of you, you want to encourage fossil hunting, I had to go over and see what he found. And so I started walking towards him. And 5 meters away, I knew his and my life were going to change. Because sticking out the side of that rock that he's holding was a hominid clavicle. That's his collarbone, the curved bone here. I knew it from 5 meters away because serendipitously, I was probably the world's expert, maybe the world's only expert on hominid clavicles at that moment. I'd done my PhD on them, all 6 fragments. As I took the rock from Matthew, he claims I cursed. I don't believe that. I was looking at this and doing what anyone would do. What else can this be? This can't be a hominid clavicle that I studied for my PhD. And I turned the rock over, and there on the back was a jawbone and a hominid canine and multiple parts of a hominid skeleton. Matthew had not just found a clavicle. He'd found one of the rarest things in all of history, a partial skeleton of a hominid. And let me say that us paleoanthropologists are very generous with that term. We call any part of the head associated with any part of the body of a single individual a partial skeleton. And at that time in history, there were approximately 7 known. You would have heard of some like Lucy, Turkana Boy, Littlefoot. The others are so fragmentary they have numbers. Matthew had found one, and it would turn out to be extraordinary. The preservation of the fossils from this site that we would call Malapa would be extraordinary and unprecedented. The fossil that Matthew had found was part of a little boy that was probably between about 7 and 9 years old when he died 2 million years ago. He was only one of a large number of skeletons that we'd find. The Malapa site would be the first site on the continent of Africa where we would find multiple skeletons together. First one, then 2 weeks later, I would find a second, then a third, then a fourth, then a fifth, and a sixth. It very quickly became one of the richest sites in the world. We were living the scientific dream. My colleagues and I had won the scientific lottery. Billions of odds chance to win. And there it was. And we had a brand new species. Something no one had ever seen before that we would call Australopithecus sediba. We lived the scientific dream. 3 special editions of the journal Science. And for those of you who aren't academics, to get your fossil on the cover of the journal Science or Nature is like, a rock star being on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. It's like what you live for. It was all over the world. Dozens of scientific papers were produced. My project grew from 1 scientist to 100 over a period of 3 years. We started discovering things at this little site that we had never seen before. Organic remains were preserved 2 million years. We found skin. We found hair attached to even the hominids themselves. it was amazing, but it was so amazing that we had to do something different. I had to design a laboratory to build over the top of that fossil deposit. And so, for a period in 2013, I was locked out of the site. We could not continue excavations. And so, I stepped back and I realized I'd made a mistake. I'd not been exploring since Matthew had said, "Dad, I found a fossil." And I had this list then of almost 800 localities. And all those localities are not just points on a map. They're not just sites like Malapa. A huge majority of them are doorways into an underworld. Because when I look at this landscape where these discoveries are made, I see something different than maybe you do. You maybe see a rolling, beautiful savanna grassland. What I see is a gigantic block of Swiss cheese. Because underneath this dolomitic limestone are caves, kilometers and kilometers of them. But they had hardly been explored, and certainly no one had a map like I did. There was a reason, though, that people didn't spend a lot of time in the deep underground. There was an idea, almost a mythology, almost a truism at that time, that the things underground were going to be young and worthless. These were modern caves. What you wanted was caves like Malapa on the surface. Those were the ancient caves that Earth had eroded down to. But I also didn't have any resources or facilities to actually explore these caves at that moment. And that's when another serendipitous moment happened. A pirate walked into my office. Wasn't a real pirate, but he kind of looked like him. Pedro Boshoff, a former student of mine back in the 1990s who had vanished to go diamond hunting in Central Africa and had failed. And there he was back in my office saying he'd made a terrible mistake in leaving paleoanthropology. He loved it, and he wanted to get back in. And why it was serendipitous was because Pedro had been a caving buddy of mine back in the 1990s. He was an expert caver. So I said, "I've got a job for you. I want you to go explore this map, but I want you to start in places that we think we know the best. Places like the Sterkfontein Valley, which had been excavated continuously since the 1930s. Places like Sterkfontein, Swartkrans, because I found new caves there, and I'd learned a lesson from Malapa, that sometimes you don't see the things you are most familiar with. Backyard syndrome can occur." And so off he went, and the greatest miracle of any of these stories I'm going to tell you actually occurred. The university allowed me to buy a motorcycle for him, and anyone who's worked with a university would understand why that's a miracle. And off he went and quickly came back. Because Pedro found out that he was no longer physiologically appropriate to get into many of these cave systems. What that means is he's a little bit too fat to get into these narrow spaces. And so we discussed and decided to enlist two amateur cavers, Rick Hunter and Steve Tucker. I have to digress for a moment and tell you, Rick Hunter was a nearly unemployed part-time construction worker who had been thrown out of high school after blowing up his high school chemistry lab. And he was a member of Mensa. And Steve Tucker was an accountant by day, but an amateur caver by night, and they were very physiologically appropriate. And so off they went. And they went into the Sterkfontein Valley as told, and I would hear from them once a week or so, and they weren't finding much at all the new sites I discovered, because like any human, they went after the new first. That's where the good discoveries are going to be made, right? In the places we haven't been before. They finished that area except for one cave site, an enormous one called the Rising Star Cave System. And the reason they did that last was because they knew, as I did, there would be nothing in there. The Rising Star Cave System is perhaps one of the best known and best explored cave sites, maybe on the continent of Africa. Every amateur caver in the region of Joburg and in South Africa has at some point trained in there. It was completely mapped. But they were being dutiful, and off they went in exploration, and they went into a chamber called Dragon's Back one evening, September 13th. Exploring after 4.5 hours, they found a crag of rock that went up, and that's why the chamber's named Dragon's Back. It looked like the scales on a mythical dragon going up. Imagine they're 40 meters below Earth. This thing ascends up 20 meters, and up they go, and at the top of it, they see a little crack, 7.5 inches wide. And they look down this crack, and then they slide into the crack, and they realize it continues downward. And so, because they're my kind of crazy, down they went. 12 meters down, skinnying in so much that if they even inhaled, they actually would stop. And fortunately, at the bottom, that chute didn't open up into a large cavern and they fell to their deaths. Otherwise, this would be a very short story. But they dropped into a relatively small chamber. And then after passing through a long, narrow passage, they saw bones on the ground. Now, they were a long way back in the system. There should not be bones on the ground. And so they began looking at them, and they thought they might be interesting. But they weren't sure. Remember, they were amateurs. They weren't experts. They pulled their camera out, and it didn't work. It had been damaged by the humidity. And so out they came, and luckily they could get out, traveling back that 4.5-hour road. They called Pedro, said they thought they might have found something interesting. And he called me the next morning, and I said, look, send me pictures, because I hear that type of thing all the time, and usually someone's found, a plastic baby doll head in their backyard, and it's nothing important. And I promptly forgot about it. Until October 1st at 9 o'clock in the evening, when my front gate buzzer buzzed, and in Johannesburg at 9 o'clock in the evening, people don't randomly buzz your front gate buzzers, and I answered it, and someone said, "You're gonna wanna let us in a creepy voice, just like that. It was Pedro with Steve. And after considering my options for a little bit, I eventually did let them in. Steve had opened up his laptop, and I saw a picture like I never thought I would see in my entire life. You are allowed to gasp when you see these things. That was a hominid mandible. And it was just lying there on dirt. I'd never seen anything like that in southern Africa. You remember that beautiful skull that Matthew had found? To get to that condition had taken 22,000 person preparation hours. It was encased in solid concrete. This is just lying there. I could tell it was primitive. I could see by the shape of the teeth. The next slide they showed me showed parts of a skeleton. I was looking at a potentially primitive hominid skeleton lying on the floor of a cave, and then I saw this, and you have to gasp when you see that. That is a skull. It's a skull. I was blown away. This was like nothing I'd ever seen. We celebrated. I sent them on their way. Couldn't sleep. 2 a.m., I decided to make a phone call. I decided to phone a friend. I phoned Theyre Garcia, head of missions at National Geographic. And even though I had caller ID, he answered his phone. And I said, "Theyre, I've got something." And I explained to them the story. I sent him a couple of these pictures. And then I said, if you are ever going to trust me right now. That's just explorer speak for I need money. Theyre paused for a moment and said, "Okay, Lee, do what you need to do." That's grant agency speak for, don't spend too much money and don't embarrass us. I hung up the phone and immediately got cold feet. Here I had just risked the entire reputation of my gigantic team with its great record on some pictures taken by amateurs in a place that I could never go and check. But I did have someone I trusted who I thought could get down a 7.5-inch, 12-meter chute. My then 15-year-old, 6'4", but very skinny son, Matthew. And so the next weekend, out we went to Rising Star, crawling through all these horrible spaces, way back into this cave, over 150 meters back in, climbing up Dragon's Back, where if you fall off, you die, getting to this little narrow thing, and down Matthew went with Rick and Steve, because I guess I'm going for Father of the Year. And I sat there in the dark at the top, shutting off my light to conserve batteries, looking at this impossible situation. What was I going to do if this was real? How would I do this? I began to build an idea of doing it like you did a deep sea discovery, like the way my colleague James Cameron or Bob Ballard explores undersea. I could see remote cabling, a command center with cameras and audio and such like that, but who was I going to get in there to do this in this incredibly dangerous space? And then I heard scrabbling, and Matthew came back up. His head pops out of the hole, and because I'm going for Father of the Year, I didn't say, are you okay? I went, and? And he handed me the camera, and he said, Dad, it was beautiful. He said, my hands were shaking for 3 minutes before I could take the first picture. And it was extraordinary. It was truly extraordinary, for there was that skull. It was real. But it also disturbed me. Because do you see all those little white bits up there? Those white bits are broken bone. And Steve and Rick and Matthew swore that they had not stepped on this. Someone had been in that chamber and stepped on some of this material. And I didn't know how recently. And so I went home, and that Sunday I was pondering, how am I going to find people to do this? I mean, I have colleagues and stuff, but this is going to take not only people with PhDs and stuff that can actually work on potentially some of the most precious material, but they have to fit. And so I did what anyone would do in that circumstance. I put a Facebook ad out. Now, you don't have to read the Facebook ad. Basically says I need skinny scientists. I need skinny scientists who will drop everything, come to Johannesburg within the next 3 weeks. I'm going to launch an expedition. I'm not going to pay you, but I will feed you, and I'm going to risk your life. And I sent that off thinking there would probably be, 5 or 6 people qualified to do this in the world. Caving desirable. Within 10 days, I had almost 60 qualified applicants. Over 80% of them were young women. From that extraordinary group of applicants, I shortlisted and picked 6 of them that just happened to be young women. And on November the 7th, we put a 60-person expedition into the field. A 60-person expedition that laid 3.5 kilometers of cabling, built command centers, built caving tents, built a science tent, all to recover this, all the safety procedures in place. And on November the 10th, we watched with trepidation as the first ones entered. The first scientist entered the cave, being led by Matthew who would show them where the material was on the ground. We had brought in new technology. And I was watching images like this, and I was watching images like this. And we also decided at that moment to bring this to the world. And so we went live on the internet. And by the end of this expedition, I'll tell you, we had over 1 million followers watching this, because I thought this was maybe the first and possibly last time in history anyone would ever see a fossil hominid being discovered, because these are the rarest sought-after objects on the planet. And during one of the blog sessions with National Geographic, I made a grave mistake. Someone said, what is it like to watch them? What are these people like? And I said, they're like astronauts. I would see them disappear in their kit, and then they would appear in black and white on these thermal cameras, and they would journey into this remote place where I can never be. But they're like underground astronauts. Oh, I wish I'd never said that. The hate mail I have received in the last years of they're not astronauts, they're speleonauts, or they're troglonauts, or what, I apologize. But it happened, and it took off. And they were extraordinary and brave. And they were applying technologies that had never been applied before. White light scanners, 3D mapping of this, because everything we had to do had to fit through 7-inch slot. It had to be rugged enough to work in this 100% humidity environment underground. By the second day, we knew I was wrong. It was not a hominid skeleton. It was more than one hominid skeleton. We had 3 right femurs, and there are no human relatives with 3 right legs. By the end of the week, we knew that something extraordinary was happening. We had found more individual hominid remains than any other site in the history of the search for human origins on the continent of Africa. It was palpable, the excitement. We knew that this was, for paleoanthropology, our Howard Carter moment. You can probably see it on the expressions of their faces that this was a great moment of discovery. And it kept getting better. It also was very confusing because they were only bringing hominid fossils up. And I began to be suspicious that they were sort of cherry picking down there. And they assured me they were not. There were only hominid fossils in this remarkable chamber. We started working from 6 a.m. into the evening, often finishing at 6 or 7 in the evening. Actually not on purpose, though. Because you see, we were working in shifts, and I would send that last shift in usually about 2 o'clock in the afternoon with the idea of them coming out at 5 because they're working in these cramped conditions, in this tiny spaces, very dangerous, very difficult, very stressful. And usually about 4:30, I'd say, okay, guys, start packing it up. And they'd say, just a minute, we're just getting this last one. By 5:30, I'd be, all right, it's really time to come up. And, they'd be, oh, we're almost done with this. It's just coming up in a moment. By 6 o'clock or 6:30, I'd be, okay, it's time to finish. And they'd say, come and get us. That wasn't going to happen. It was an extraordinary moment of science. By the end of the expedition, we had discovered more fossil hominid remains than in the entire history of the search for human origins on the continent of Africa. A 3.5-week expedition designed to find one skeleton. Now, I'm going to pause for a moment because many people think I'm exaggerating when I talk about the dangers of this. And just because we haven't killed anyone speaks more to actually our safety procedures and protocols than it does this. I'll show you the kind of journey to the cave and chamber. This is one of the easy parts. We call this Superman crawl for obvious reasons because you extend your arm above your head to fit through. This is nothing. Rick is going through now. I can get through that. This is about halfway there. And these remarkable scientists and technicians and cavers and safety cavers were making that journey back and forth up to 9 times a day. A 240-meter journey that would take about 45 minutes for an experienced caver. And that's all before descending that chute. From this point on, they journey through some other squeezes, they climb Dragon's Back, and there at the top, they have to take the journey down that chute. Now, I'm using this picture for a very deliberate reason. I want you to understand that I am an equal opportunity child abuser. That's my daughter Megan up there. She would sit at the top of the chute in a position we called chute troll, minding the communication link between us and the command center and down below, 15 meters down below her with the people excavating the caves. And she would go up and down that chute as many as 10 times a day in order to carry fossils up because it was too narrow to even put equipment in. Do you want to see what it's like inside of that chute? The claustrophobe should probably look away at this moment. This is what happens as you drop out of that chute into the chamber below. That's you've been doing for the previous 12 meters all the way down. And he's still smiling. This chamber was remarkable. We would name the chamber the naledi chamber in tribute to the rising star cave system. Naledi in the Sotho language means chamber of stars. And as I said, at the end of the expedition, it had instantly become the richest fossil hominid site discovered in all of history on the continent of Africa, perhaps in the world. We'd recovered well over 1,500 individual remains, representing at least 15 individuals from a surface collection and a 1 meter by 1 meter by 20 centimeter deep excavation. The floor appeared to be literally made of these fossils, and they were truly extraordinary. It was a strange looking creature. It had a flat face. It had a tiny brain that we could measure at about 450 to 500 cubic centimeters. We seemed to have males, which were heavily built, and females that were lighter built, but they were very close in size, much like human sexual dimorphism is. We had many individuals beautifully preserved in dentition, almost 200 individual teeth from this area. We had beautifully articulated remains, like this foot, which was one of 6 feet, almost everything we had was the most complete that had ever been found in the entire fossil hominid record. We had the most complete hands ever found, all 8 of them that were recovered. And this is just a tiny percentage of this remarkable sample that had come out of this chamber. Well, how do you study a sample this large in a field that had previously been confined to scraps, where I myself had done my entire PhD on the shoulder girdle of hominids on 13 fragments from across the continent? And so we again went to social media and to our colleagues, and we found a nest of early career scientists, the best and brightest, with data sets that they were willing to share in an open way, something not traditional in paleoanthropology. Over 40 scientists that we brought together in Johannesburg from all over the world, including some of the members of the Sediba team, because they were already world experts in analyzing skeletons, and we went to work on that. And in the end, we described an extraordinary creature, a new species, another one, to science. Except this one was in our genus, we were certain. We would call it Homo naledi, and it truly was a mystery to behold. It had a tiny brain, about the third the size of modern human brains that you can see imposed in the background. It had bizarre ape-like shoulders, in fact, almost gibbon-like shoulders. It had a chest like an ape, a spine that was tiny but resembled in some ways Neanderthal spines. As you went down its arms became more and more and more human-like until you hit that hand, which was incredibly human-like in the wrist and almost superhuman in the proportions. The thumb was elongated, but the fingers were curved. Curved like the most primitive ancient human relatives we had that dated to 4 or 5 million years old. The legs were equally bizarre. From a primitive pelvis, they were primitive at the top and became more and more advanced, more human-like until you reach those feet, which were the most human-like that anyone had ever seen outside of humans. We would call this species Homo naledi. Naledi means star in the Sotho language. And there you can see it, there over on the right-hand side. A strange, skinny, elongated, almost pin-headed creature that shared many things with us and many things we haven't seen. It looked like one of the most primitive members of our genus. It was more primitive than Homo erectus, who you see in the middle there, but less primitive than Australopithecines like Lucy, who you see there. A strange mosaic. It seemed to say that maybe human origins hadn't happened the way we thought. Was this a replacement for Homo habilis, the roots of our genus? We knew more about this species because we had everything from infants to the elderly. Over 15 individuals had every bone represented except the hyoid in the throat multiple times. But we didn't know how old it was. When we published it, many of our colleagues told us how old it was. They said that it's primitive. It's got to be at least 2 to 3 million years old. And we said, we don't know. It's just lying here on the floor of the cave. And of course, it's sitting here in this chamber that's almost impossible to get to. And through all of our research, we cannot find another entrance. They appear to have been using the same chute we use to get in. And so when we published Homo naledi, we came out with a hugely controversial hypothesis. We said there is only one reason we can think of why there would be only Homo naledi inside of this chamber. Because despite what you may have heard, monospecific assemblages of vertebrates, terrestrial vertebrates, are almost unknown, except in one species, ours. And the reason is we separate our dead from the environment. It's almost a universal truism of humans. It's almost one of our identifying features. And we were claiming that we had discovered the first clearly non-human species of hominid, of bipedal ape, that was also deliberately disposing of its dead. That did not please many people. They said it was impossible. They said it's a single occurrence. You can't make a claim like that on one occurrence. So we found another one, 110 meters away in another chamber. that we would call the Lacetti chamber, we found this remarkable skeleton and two other individuals, except this time they're tucked into alcoves in the walls of the cave. Exactly the same anatomy. And I can tell you here that we've actually found more situations like that. This rising star cave system is full of these incredible creatures. And when we announced this remarkable skeleton, we also announced that we had finally got a date. After 11 different techniques, 5 different labs, double-blind, we came up with the remarkable idea that Homo naledi was not 2 million years old, as it should be by its anatomy, or 3, but it was between 2 and 300,000 years old. Why is that remarkable? Because it kills a lot of sacred cows. We had thought that human evolution had worked in a progressive thing with ultimately larger brain hominids always replacing, perhaps driving to extinction, the models that went before them. At 200,000 to 300,000 years in Africa, we know by the archaeology that modern humans are arising there. All this early technology, even in southern Africa, is becoming more and more complex. It's a hallmark of this big brain and the evolving idea inside of the human mind that is modern human origins. But Homo naledi is sitting there in Africa with all those tools and archaeology around it and almost no evidence of a large-brained hominid anywhere near. It was startling and disturbing. Had we got it wrong? Well, we now know that there are multiple species of hominids across the world at that time, some of them very odd. The Flores hobbits in Indonesia you might have heard of. Some of you may have heard just earlier this year the 350,000-year-old large-brained hominids at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. And Neanderthals are emerging at this time in Europe. What is Homo naledi? Well, the answer is we have no idea. We don't know where it fits into this picture. If it fits into our evolution, is it a kin of ours or is it part of us? I'm so glad we didn't find Homo naledi 10 or 15 years ago, because we're able to apply technologies to these fascinating questions about this extraordinary species that didn't exist. Technologies like these, this is LiDAR underground cave, and we can add that to augmented virtual reality, and we'll be releasing next year high-resolution augmented virtual reality so you can enter those chambers and explore them and discover in them in the way we are. We are able to look inside the heads of these skeletons with the highest resolution scanners down to 50 microns, pulling things out like the brains of these hominids, which impress themselves on the inside of skulls. Extraordinary images that are telling us more about these creatures in the past, how they lived, how they thought. And we have seen Homo naledi's brain. And Homo naledi's brain is perhaps the most complex brain we have ever seen outside of human brains and Neanderthal brains, yet packaged in this tiny package. Had they figured out how to get beyond some of those issues of an expensive brain tissue? We don't know, because we've not found Homo naledi outside of this occurrence. Homo naledi is going to lead us into a disruptive age of paleoanthropology. It sits out of time and place. My colleagues who guessed that that deposit was going to be 2 to 3 million years old weren't wrong. Homo naledi must have originated then. It's that primitive. But it remained invisible to us, coming down through time. Imagine that. We missed an entire complex species that must have existed for 2 or more million years. And then we found it. What does it mean for other things that we might have missed? And so, I had learned, I am a slow learner, but I had learned something from the Malapa experience in Australopithecus sediba. I had learned that sometimes we don't see the things that we think we know the best. Sometimes we don't see our own backyards. Sometimes we think the best discoveries are in these far-off places that others haven't explored. And so we didn't stop exploring. And so the new maps of what the cave sites that we're looking out there are not in just the hundreds, but in the thousands. We have found over 250 fossil localities in the most explored area on planet Earth. 250 fossil localities other scientists hadn't seen. And they thought that the age of exploration in this field was over. We are also finding extraordinary new fossils. And I do not exaggerate when I say this. We are finding fossils like this. That is a block that is about 90 centimeters by 60 centimeters. And every bone you're looking at is a hominid bone. That block right this moment is in Lockheed Martin in Dallas, Texas, being scanned in a military micro-CT scanner so that we can look inside of it. And we can see the remains of the bones that we know are there because we put it in a medical CT scanner. And what we're going to do with this, because we sit in this amazing moment of discovery, is we're going to leave that in there. And we're going to digitally prepare, using researchers from across the globe actually competing with artificial intelligence, to bring these bones from inside out, print them, and share them with other scientists and the public live as we do it over the next 6 months. And then we can preserve this material for future generations of scientists who may be able to do things with discoveries like this that we can't imagine now. And that's the place we are in. This story that I've told you has a number of messages deeply within it. One is that there's always a way to do something without destroying it. Some of you may be thinking, why didn't you just open that chute up, Lee, so you could happily walk in there with your non-physiologically appropriate body? The reason is because sometimes we do better things when we challenge ourselves as humans. Why would we jump to destruction when we can use technology and advanced technology and find extraordinary humans that can actually do this work? Extraordinary humans that can become inspiration for this and the next generation, who are true explorers at the front end of science, making discoveries, risking their lives, and bringing us information about ourselves. You know, I speak to audiences all over the world, many of them children. And something that deeply bothers me is that almost universally, particularly children will say, the age of exploration's over. That was the age of when people went out in ships to new lands and found new islands that weren't occupied, who climbed mountains for the first time, who went into deep jungles to make discoveries of lost civilizations. But those days are gone. If I go into this, all I'm going to do is just stand on the shoulder of these giants and make tiny contributions. I think many scientists in many fields think like this. I want you to take from this, though, that is a lie. It's a lie that we as humans have convinced yourselves. This story about the discovery of Sediba and Naledi tell us that's a lie. That first site was discovered in the most explored area on planet Earth for sites and objects like this, and it was so easy to do, a 9-year-old could do it. The second site, the Dinaledi Chamber in the Rising Star Cave System, was inside of the most explored cave possibly on the continent of Africa, in a place that someone else had been that clearly had not recognized what extraordinary things were beneath their feet. They were not prepared for discovery. That is what we need to do. We need to use stories of science and exploration sciences like this to not only encourage, but to inspire this generation and the next that there are still things to be discovered. We must teach people how to be prepared for discovery. We must make them believe in discovery. We must teach children that you don't need to do extreme things to get on the pages of things like New Scientist. You don't need to climb the south side of Everest naked with a dead parrot on your shoulder to be a first. There are great discoveries right in front of us. We must build in ourselves, in humanity, and in our children the spirit of exploration, and we must never stop exploring. Thank you very much, everyone.